Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield, welcoming you to another episode of the show that explores our place in time. And what is time? How do we know time except through the body? So it's with delight that this week I get around to a long overdue topic on this show. Rhythms in the body, circadian rhythms, lunar cycles, and sleep, with our guest Jessa Gamble, the editor of the Last Word on Nothing science blog and the author of The Siesta and the Midnight Sun, a cool book about how we are literally made out of clocks at the molecular level. If we are to measure our time by the quality, the kairos, the timeliness of it's time for a nap or it's time to get up and look for food, that's one thing. But then also there is the chronological time, the sheer quantity and number, the measure of our lives. And as soon as we're thinking of things in that light, then of course it's not long before we ask ourselves, what are we doing with our time? And a third of our lives we spend asleep. So this conversation orbits some increasingly pressing questions about why we sleep at all. Can we defeat sleep? Can we unlock that one full third of our lives we spend unconscious? And if we can, should we? Get ready for a stimulating and rigorous conversation about the nature of time in the body. One that left me with more questions than I had going in. Left me wanting more. But before we get into that, Future Fossils is a crowd-sponsored show. I have a page at Patreon/Michael Garfield where you can, for the price of a coffee or a sandwich every month, score yourself a bunch of unique and exclusive supplementary content to this show, additional writing and audio recordings, including the music that you're listening to right now, actually, which is from a show I played in Australia while I was on tour back in February. And that album is entirely free to Patreon supporters. Also, very soon, I'll have some coloring book pages posted up there for you doodlers. My enduring, timeless love and thanks to everyone who supports the show on Patreon. But of course, there are other cheaper ways you can help this podcast get into the ears of the people who appreciate it and the people who would appreciate it. Because after all, this entire project is framed as a service to posterity and the benefit of all sentient beings. One of those ways is by getting onto iTunes and leaving a quick review. Even outright trolling helps due to the Streisand effect. No press is bad press, friends. So if you can take a moment and let people know how this show has abused your ears and ruined your week, then please do so. I thank you for it. Helps me keep this show ad-free because God knows we all have enough of that. Anyway, here we go, folks. My chat with science journalist Jessa Gamble. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Thanks for listening. Well, cool. Thanks for taking the time to join me on the show. Yeah, I've been following Last Word on Nothing at a distance for a while. I haven't been keeping excellent track of it, but when I found it, I was really pleased to note that there's this renegade science writing out there like this. And
yeah, there aren't too many people who actually sort of go to the site on a regular basis just to read the content. They tend to come in through sort of various links, but I can only hope that seeing that it's the Last Word on Nothing thing, maybe that's why part of the reason they're clicking on the link or something.
Yeah, well, so I think I explained this to you in the email. But the reason that I'm excited to have you on the show is that this is a show that explores time from every available angle. And
yes.
given that you have spent so much of your science career investigating time and temporality, it felt like you're just a totally perfect guest. Because one of the things that we haven't done on this show yet is get into temporality in the body and biological rhythms and circadian cycles and, the varying ways that different organisms handle the issue of rhythmicity. So, what got you into this study in the first place?
I was in university taking behavioral neuroscience, sort of working in a lab with rats and so on. And one of the experiments had to do with circadian rhythms. And it was, when you see it, the sort of the graph. So it's hard to explain a graph as like really exciting, but it actually is like the eeriest thing. If you see these free running rats who are in a constant light environment, and yet somehow they know exactly when to get up every day, and yet it just slips just a tiny, just a few minutes every day toward a later timetable. It's just like this hidden force. And ever after that, I just wanted to kind of stop people in the street and tell them that this was something that affects all of us and that is driving a lot of us, and we just have no conscious access to it.
Yeah, it reminds me, not to, dumb this down, but it reminds me, I'm a big fan of the show Northern Exposure.
Okay.
Which, again, dates me temporarily. There's an episode where the doctor, Joel Fleischman, who is unaccustomed to living in Alaska, goes through his first Alaskan summer, and there's goes through the month plus of northern Alaskan 24-hour sunlight, and goes totally manic and insane. And
I'm so glad that was represented, because it's funny, because people know about seasonal affective disorder in terms of depression in the winter, but there is this little known kind of flip side of it, which is that if you have sort of the propensity for bipolar, these sorts of Arctic summers can really trigger manic episodes, and even in sort of regular, people who don't suffer from these problems, you really do have the sense that it's never quite bedtime.
Yeah. So that notion, and I also, that episode, they go through this whole thing where they're like, boy, you're going to crash hard. So, everyone in the town who's lived there for a while is warning him that he needs to deliberately try and reintroduce a diurnal rhythm into his life and wear eye masks and stuff so that he can get proper sleep. But he's like, no, this is the most productive I've ever been. He's just like sitting in the gym, like shooting 3-pointers. And then, of course, at the end of the tragicomic finale of it is that, the body doesn't actually sustain that. Right. So what happened to the rats, just out of curiosity?
Oh, well, I mean, they didn't meet a good end. No lab rats do, I'm afraid. They all you call it sacrificed, but this is one of the reasons that I left science and went into writing about science, because it is sort of a morally deflating experience to work with animals. And in this case, it was a University of Toronto. It was in this sub-basement, like secret lab that nobody talked about, and there's cockroaches everywhere, and you couldn't kill them because the red Burmese jungle fowl in the corner, who were like the sort of the wild type of the chicken that people were experimenting on, they actually ate those cockroaches. So it was part of the ecosystem. So you couldn't put any like chemicals down. So you would open the door to the lab, and you just turn on the light, and all these cockroaches like scuttle for cover, and it was just so depressing. And then you have to kill rats, and that just tops it off.
You're not the only person I know that left the laboratory environment because of rat killing. But I guess this is a total tangent, but I'm confused as to, I've never heard of a lab where the cockroaches living in the building were food. Like intentionally food for the lab. And is that just a cheap department decision?
I mean, it's not like they were sort of swept up and put in a dish. They just happened to be, they would peck them off the floor. They would, it wasn't an official. I mean, maybe it was a confound in the study, because actually they were, the food was not an exact measurement.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and this is a tangent for me too, but the way that you have to kill rats in order to preserve their brain intact, to check that you've damaged the right part of the brain, to check what the brain does, it feels almost ritualistic. It's like this, you sort of have to pickle them alive, and it's really just gross. But I am interested in the results of this work, which is why I feel conflicted about that.
Totally. So you had your moral crisis at the same time that you discovered this extraordinary thing about there being a hidden rhythmicity underlying our relationship to sunlight. And then you went directly into writing your book on this, or where did
No. So that about 10 years later, I started the book. So in between that, I went up to live in the Arctic, and I discovered sort of the cultural aspect of this, which was, as you mentioned, the sort of the traditional societies up in the Arctic are highly seasonal, and yet as Westerners, we've sort of like imported our year-round 9-to-5 schedule on the work day there, which makes no sense at all. So in the winter, you're just dragging yourself to work and feeling so lazy and like just hating yourself. And then in the summer, the 7-year-olds are booting around on bikes around town at 3 a.m. It's just, it doesn't correspond to sort of the artificial society that we've sort of exported from Europe. So that element of it kind of mapped on to my understanding of the biological rhythms, and I thought maybe I sort of have something to say about this.
Again, I love giving cultural reference points for people. I'm sure that you have seen the vampire graphic novel 30 Days of Night.
Was there a movie of that?
There was a
Barrow, Alaska?
Josh Hartnett. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that whole notion, it's like, why hasn't anyone explored that? And then again, the other side of that is Insomnia, which was a Swedish film that they made into an American translation with, was it Stellan Skarsgård and Robin Williams as a villain, and they're exploring the influence of 24-hour sunlight on the like film noir, on the detective story, and how the detective is like losing his mind in the process of what is a film noir when you don't have night at all.
Yes.
But anyway, so it is a very interesting trope that seems to come up again and again. And so one of the things that you discuss, I want to post some links in the show notes to your TED Talk, as well as to your article in the Atlantic and some other stuff. So some of the things that you discuss in that material is how different organisms handle this differently. And so we have like an evolutionary tree where you can see relationships between organisms and explore them in the way that these different biochemical systems have come online at different points in evolutionary history. I wonder if you would speak to that and where temporality, or where these circadian rhythms emerge for us at different points in evolutionary history and why.
So they emerge very early because it's a huge advantage to be able to anticipate food, for example, that happens every day at a regular time. It's good to be able to anticipate predators, and to make that such a regular thing that you don't, if it's a cloudy day, you don't like forget to get up just because it's not light. You don't, if you're just responding to sunlight, then you're at a disadvantage to like the little, squirrel who's already prepared. So almost all of life has this rhythmicity, and it's because of the rotation of the Earth, right? Life on Earth is rhythmic because we're on this rotating planet. And so it really is one of our deepest connections to, like, not to be all woo about it, but like to the universe, that we're sort of like, if we didn't already accept that the world was spherical and turns on an axis, then this should convince us of that, because it's right ingrained in our biology. And so that came very early, but the recognition in medicine, let's say, that there is this fourth dimension to our nature, that we are not only organized spatially, so we have organs that do particular things within the body and systems that, are organized, but we also are organized temporally. So we're different creatures at night than we are in the daytime. And we're undergoing totally different processes, and our abilities are different at different times of day. World records are broken at different times of day, and so on. So that's something that is interesting. So, this TED Talk that you mentioned, so this was given quite a while ago, and it was, at that time, I was interested in looking at the ancestral sleep cycle of humans. So this whole idea of going to sleep for 8 hours a night in this consolidated period, sort of on a raised platform in a room with 4 walls, this 8-hour kind of recommendation by doctors. This is all a very modern phenomenon, and it's since the sort of advent of artificial light. But before that, we had a totally different rhythm, which was fascinating for me to discover. So we took sort of an anti-nap in the middle of the night, which was different in quality from any of our waking time today. It was very sort of meditative and kind of dreamlike and relaxed, and sort of, people would sort of have sex then, or they would pray, or they would visit, family and stuff. And it was like this other scheduled interlude that we don't have. And so this was fascinating to me, and I gave a TED Talk about it. But just, to warn any viewers who do go to CLIA, I'm not advocating for a return to this schedule, because a lot of people, I think, have taken that from it. I'm actually kind of a sci-fi kid, and I'm interested in how we can manipulate our cycles and eliminate sleep, or go in totally radical directions. So that's. Are
you a subscriber to modafinil and other military stimulants? So
modafinil is like a giant letdown. I don't know. There was such a hype about it in 2005-06 kind of thing. They're like, oh, this is the new generation of eugeroics. But it's since sort of been shown to be no more effective really than caffeine. It's just that it has a longer half-life and so on. It's okay. It's kind of a cognitive enhancer. It's sort of interesting, but I don't think it's the answer. I think the answer is to replace sleep rather than delay it, and to find out what the brain actually needs to get done, which we're starting to know now, and to do that in a shorter time.
Well, okay, so before we get on to that, because I think getting into the actual physical basis for sleep and why human beings seem to need so much of it is a very interesting line of investigation, and why certain people need less than other people. You have these
bastards,
sleepless fuckers, but of course that's just me importing the cultural values of my own hyper-productive North American 21st century nonsense onto this, my Protestant values colonializing my body in some respects. Right. But before we get into that, and then also I'm curious to explore. There's so many ways to take this, but first, this issue of the first sleep and the second sleep, and then your book Siesta and the Midnight Sun. So there's a sort of a yin yang going on here, where we have the anti-nap in the middle of the night, and then the nap in the middle of the day, and it seems like that's sort of the wormhole through which we can address the related issue of how other animals have a completely different structure to their cycle, the nocturnal animals, and this issue, and also deep sea creatures, and how they don't have any light at all down in the very pelagic depths of it.
That is true. It's literally only occurring to me now that I don't know what they do in terms of circadian rhythms. I'm the so-called expert. I really don't. That's
because you've got the submarine people, right? And the submarine watches have been rolling on an 18-hour cycle for since the beginning of the submarine. So it seems like that was. People found a sort of a healthy stride with that. And when I moved
Yeah.
down to Texas from Colorado a couple years ago, I realized that
Where are you in Texas?
in Austin, Texas.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And in the hill country around Austin and really all over Texas and Mexico and the American Southwest, there's a lot of desert creatures that, for obvious reasons, are not going to do so well in the heat of the day. And so they have adapted this completely opposite sleep schedule. So I'm curious, what you, having not read your book, full disclosure.
No, I don't. So nocturnality is not that complex to sort of implement in people. So mammals our big innovation was being nocturnal. So we have that in our evolutionary history. Having the ability to regulate our own temperature allowed us to go into that niche, right, to colonize the night. And that was a big thing for animals. And then humans sort of like retrograde, sort of evolved toward diurnal rhythms again. So we sort of went there and we went back, but we sort of still have that in us. In terms of siesta and so on, there's some biological basis that has been shown. There's a sort of a dip in our energy levels. It's called postprandial, which means like after a meal or after lunch. But actually it happens whether you eat or not. So there's some basis for that. There are also things that Arctic species do to change their rhythm. So caribou put like a filter on their eyes during the summer so that they don't like see the spectrum of light that's going to inhibit their melatonin. And so they basically feed, their rhythms are determined by eating instead of by sunlight, because the sunlight is no longer useful as a cue.
Huh. And is that a year-round thing, or is that a seasonal filter?
Seasonal. That's a seasonal filter, and then they go back to being like the rest of us.
Damn.
They turn, I think their eyes turn yellow, and then they go back to blue.
Whoa. So blue blockers, like you get into this for anyone who's done any kind of long highway driving, and you can kind of avoid road hypnosis through, wearing the blue blocking like aviation lenses. My mom was big on that. So, okay. And then, man, I'm trying not to make this just a list of questions that I have for you. But when you bring up the fact that we have this slightly more than 24-hour cycle, I guess my question is, why isn't it precisely 24 hour, or like, the Earth's rotation isn't precisely 24 hours, but why isn't it precisely matched to the Earth's rotation in the first place? Like,
right.
We've been at this for over 4 billion years. What the hell?
Yeah. And I mean, the question of why is always a little bit tricky with evolution, because there is no why, there is only adapting. But as you say, you're adapting to something that, is a precise time period. So what we know about that is that we're able to calibrate our clocks based on that little bit of overlap. There are also individual differences in terms of the lengths of our circadian cycle. So if you are a late person, that means your circadian cycle is longer, your free running cycle, than a morning person's would be. And it's so as soon as the sun sort of hits the back of your eye, then that message travels to the master clock in your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that sort of orchestrates all the timing in your body, and it's like it communicates with the lesser clocks in the different organs and so on. So yeah, you kind of need some of your time periods to overlap with light or dark so that it's always a delicate balance. It's maybe not the ideal way to set it up if you were doing it from scratch, but biology never is.
Well, then again, I guess the Earth's rotation has also shifted slightly over the years. I mean, we've been with that tidal lock with the moon, and the moon's orbit has its distance from the Earth has changed over the years. So it might be that we're like constantly having to renegotiate around chemical systems that evolved within a different context than the context that currently exists, right?
Yeah. That's true, and I don't know how much of an effect that had on the circadian rhythms. I mean, it's sort of a difference of minutes, is it not? Is it?
Yeah, I think
there's a whole question in astrobiology as to what sort of rhythms aliens will have, because obviously the rotation of their cycles will be matched to the rotation of those planets, and it's interesting because you can sort of engineer rats and other animals that have different cycle lengths, and really their home planet is like somewhere out there rotating at that frequency.
That's kind of sad.
It is. You're making a little alien.
We've made a rat for another world that it's got that there's actually, what was that, An American Tale, where it's that romantic, like sitting under the stars knowing she's out there somewhere. But it does lead...
Nobody understands my rhythms.
Yeah, it does lead directly into the next thing, which is, I was going to ask you about that kind of research into engineering different rhythms, because we're coming up on, this kind of precipitous moment in human history where we're going to start sending people to other planets permanently. Yes. Mm-hmm. And those people, like the Martian day is like 25 minutes longer than Earth day.
Yeah, right? It's like 24 and a half. And so the guys who were kind of remotely operating the Curiosity probes, they tried for a phase of that mission to actually live on Martian time. And there were people who were from the Harvard kind of circadian rhythms sort of crew were monitoring them to see if they ever adjusted, and they never did. They just were slightly jet lagged at all times.
Oh God. Is that just because they're actually leaving the building and going home, and they're still subjecting themselves to that?
Yeah, because they weren't in sort of like isolation chambers where the lights were only on at those times or anything like that. But it's a form of shift work that is rotating. So that's sort of notoriously the worst form of shift work, as well as the kind that goes night, morning, afternoon, night, morning, afternoon, even though it's popular because every 3 days you get to see your family.
Jeez. It sounds like they're actually having a lot more trouble than the 18-hour submarine shift people, because they're in this kind of controlled environment where they're exposed to a regular rhythmicity with lighting and everything, and that it might actually just, maybe we don't even need to engineer Martian circadian rhythms. It sounds like we're more or less flexible enough in our cycles that we can pull it off.
We can, but your body notices. So if you're eating in the middle of the night, like in the middle of your internal night, it's really bad, and you don't feel it, but it's like, because that's when your liver's sort of like shut down its protein production. So you develop things like diabetes much quicker and things like that.
I was just reading I think it was New York Times, they were talking about, again, another tangent, but they were talking about the Russian cosmonauts on the International Space Station and the research that they had just done on salt intake.
Oh, yeah?
They were saying that everything we know, I just tweeted this, I'll send you a link. They were just saying everything we know about salt metabolism might be wrong, because they were thinking that salt actually creates more water in the body by increasing the production of glucocorticoid steroids and metabolizing fats and muscle tissue in the body. And so the common understanding that people have that salt makes you thirsty actually has to do with a reaction from the tongue, and that they found over the length of this study that people eating large amounts of salt actually required less of a water intake, but were hungrier because their body was breaking down fat and muscle tissue faster to produce water in order to balance out the salt. So that
sounds like a really significant finding in terms of mechanism, which is always more interesting than sort of correlation.
Right, but at the same time they were saying don't OD on salt as a dietary measure, in order to lose weight, because of exactly what you're saying, that this massive surge in glucocorticoids in the body can overtax your liver and lead to pre-diabetic conditions and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But let's roll it back, as it were. Let's go counterclockwise here and get to the issue of sleep, because we touched on this just a moment ago, that we wish we didn't. And we're looking at people who are these like super performer, low sleep people for some sort of indication of how we might be able to engineer interventions. So, I mean, could you get into that a little bit? And like what's, on the one hand, what science currently has to say about why we need sleep, and then how we might be able to interrupt that, so that we can work in the Amazon warehouse for 24 hours a day. Yay!
Well, okay, so I mean, and that is definitely where people first go when they hear, oh, we wouldn't need to sleep as much. But of course, like, you could spend that time, playing with your children, or, all of the quality time that you don't have in your current work schedule. But given the productivity kind of culture, people assume that you would just spend that time either working or being forced to work. So here is what we need to do when we're sleeping, or what our brain needs to do. As we go about our day and we learn things, the connections between our neurons strengthen. And that's what a memory is. It's sort of a strong network of neurons who are connected, functionally connected. So when one fires, the one that it's connected to is more likely to pass the message on. So this cannot continue indefinitely. You can't just get stronger and stronger neurons. And that's a problem that, like, neural networks face this problem too. Artificial intelligence is sort of like grappling with the same thing, is that you end up with what's called catastrophic interference. You just like saturate the whole network, and then you forget everything immediately. So it needs to be regulated, the strength of these neurons. So as you're sleeping, the brain is degrading the strength of the connections between your brain cells. But the key is that it's sort of doing them more or less equally. It's protecting some specifically, but on a relative level, you still have your memories, pretty much. But when you wake up, you're actually able to learn again because you are still flexible. Whereas when you're sleepy, the almost definition of being sleepy is you cannot really learn anymore. So sleep is really sort of other things happen during sleep, but it really is a brain thing. And the brain has to be offline for that to happen. You can't be processing things from the environment at the same time. So can this be done in a shorter amount of time now that we know what we have to get done? This happens during slow wave sleep. We can see it happen. We can observe the connection, the synapses getting weaker. Yes, we can enhance this. We can enhance it actually through something as non-invasive as a tone, regularly chirping in your ear. And this is something that's like being developed right now. Philips Respironics is on it. Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin is like actively developing this. And it would cut off, let's say an hour of of course, the line is always, we're doing this for people who have sleep problems or, aging, cognitive this and that. It's because they don't want to talk about human enhancement, but this is what it is. And to me, that's exciting. And to others, this is horrifying, but it is what it is. So
the conservatives, there's no undoing the transhumanism thing.
No, exactly.
It's just gonna happen. And my friends not to cut you off, I'm really curious to hear what the rest of this, but like my friends in Austin run this conference called the Body Hacking Convention. And we had Trevor Goodman, the conference organizer, on the show. I think he was like episode 15. And he was saying a lot of this stuff, you have to cloak it in the medical language. And so a big part of the PR for this event is models who were born without an arm, who are using the prosthetic arm, or, there's people who, this is a whole other subject, but, the designer babies thing starts with, a baby who's going to be born with a terminal condition. And wouldn't you help that baby? But this is the playbook for DARPA, basically, is, how we it doesn't seem like there's any separation ultimately between necessity and like a cosmetic desire to transcend ourselves.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, DARPA, it's such a funny animal. Like, I mean, I kind of wish there was a Canadian DARPA. I'm in Canada, but like,
CARPA.
you look at it, you're like, you're just not sure if it's like from the genius part of DARPA or like the bullshit part. And it's just, they kind of blend into one another.
There's no separating the blessing and the curse of the American visionary frontier spirit.
That was beautifully put.
It's just, I mean, it is. It's just not possible. You look at, I mean, I'm really fascinated by the efforts that are being made to create like sense webs in natural ecosystems, like in the Great Barrier Reef, for example, to facilitate conservation projects. But like, I met a friend, these people have been trying to connect me to this guy who lives in LA and manages $2 million portfolios for various DARPA research projects. And I asked him, I was like, so like, what do what's some of the things you're working on? And he's like, well, one of them is preventing illegal fishing. Oh, well, how are you doing that? By tracking every boat in the world simultaneously and like measuring its water displacement so that we can calculate whether or not it has more than the legal amount of catch in its hull at any given time. It's like you get into these issues where it's like the only way that we can do any good is by doing something that up to the sort of contemporary sensibilities is unequivocally evil. And so,
right.
A lot of this...
Like deep surveillance type stuff.
A lot of this stuff is really, really tied into these profound ethical issues of, I mean, I've got this Jurassic Park tattoo, but it's like, it's not because...
You're into de-extinction?
I am into de-extinction, and as far as, talking about screwing up the chronology, but also it's not, the book Jurassic Park and the movie Jurassic Park kind of have two different messages or morals. And like the movie oversimplifies things and says, oh, we're crossing a line here that we shouldn't cross. Whereas the book is just saying, things are far, far, far more complex than we understand, and we have to be mindful of these unintended secondary interactions and, the fractal chaotic boundary between the known and unknown, and move into these spaces with humility, which is often, not where a lot of these research projects are coming from. But anyway... That's
true, although that can be overplayed. Like, for example, we have completely overhauled the way that our sort of reproductive systems work through birth control, and nothing terrible happened. We just have smaller families. So, sometimes the awful consequences that are supposed to be punishment for, acting like you're a god don't actually happen.
I think the god is like a relative, it's a horizon. It's not a fixed point.
Right.
This notion that we're turning into gods and that we're going to get to this technological singularity.
Yes.
It's like, well, we've crossed that point at like 50 different times in Earth history. Multicellularity was a technological singularity. Photosynthesis and glycolysis was a technological singularity. Written language, and before that even spoken language, was a technological singularity. So it's good to keep that shit in perspective.
Right.
Anyway, so hacking sleep, where are we with that?
I mean, we're not where we would be if we had decided to do it, to really just go for it. Which we haven't. What we've decided to do is look at the fact that we're all sleep deprived, that it's making us unhealthy, that it's making us, accident prone, that it is making us stupider, because sleep is the most effective cognitive enhancer that we know about. The fact that we're sleep deprived is then met with a whole slew of people who say, well, so we need to sleep more. This is the solution. Whatever you were doing for that last night, the last hour of the evening last night that you thought was so important, actually you should have been sleeping. So just like, that's your fault. But there are other things that we could be doing, like, seeing if we can cut down on our actual need for sleep so that we can all do the things we'd like to do more of. And it's interesting when you talk to people about being able to extend your waking lifespan, because this is really an issue of, it's sort of the low-hanging fruit in the longevity debate, I think. Because, if you don't need to do it, then all of a sudden the waking lifespan is the equivalent of sort of a 150-year-old or something. So that would be pretty rad, in my opinion. But a lot of people, it's almost like a psychological defense mechanism that they think, I would get so bored, in the middle of the night with nothing to do. Whereas there's other people, they have enough goals for like 7 different lifetimes. And so they know exactly what they would do at that time. And I've started sort of categorizing people by their response to this idea and like how much they long for oblivion.
Oh, ooh, that's almost like you're getting into the Freudian death drive there. Yeah.
There's this panic. There's just this flash of panic. I wish I could take a picture, just like when you say it, and then they're staring into the void when they think about this possibility. To
sleep, perchance to dream. Did you read Douglas Rushkoff's book Present Shock?
I did not.
Oh, highly recommended.
Did I read of this?
I was reading it in New York in 2013, and it was such a perfect time to read it because he was talking about the way that the city's architecture is being optimized for the efficient communication of stock prices and and high frequency algorithmic trading. And
Flash Boys kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a very much a Chronos rather than Kairos kind of a conversation. But one of the theses of his book is that we can reconcile this ultra fast, beyond human comprehension digital time that we're now all embedded in with the organic rhythms of the human body if we take into account the way that those organic rhythms show up for us in the quality of our human experience. And he points to this particular research. I just found it, and I'll post this in the show notes also, that the lunar cycles are, the 4 weeks of the month are associated with spikes in 4 different neurotransmitters. So like the week of the full moon, it's acetylcholine. And then the next week it's serotonin. And then the next week it's dopamine. And then the last week it's
under
norepinephrine.
Our urban environment?
Yeah. It seems like it has to do with tidal influence, I think. And so he lives in New York. And so he said that what he did to experiment with this was each of these neurotransmitters is, associated with a particular kind of human experience and a preference for certain types of activity. So he started to reorganize his entire month around the lunar cycle and these neurotransmitters, and found that his word count writing this book went up 40%.
Shut up.
No, he limited himself to writing only 1 week a month, and then he spent 1 week on research, and he spent 1 week on networking, and then he spent 1 week on, I forget, like physical activity or just getting out and playing with his kids or something, and that his productivity had a huge spike. So that there's this intersection where, and I feel like this is almost an advertisement for your work in this area also, that the better we understand these things that we have been trying to push out of the human story for the last couple hundred years, I mean, certainly since the invention of artificial light, that the more we, and like you were saying about the 9 to 5 day above the Arctic Circle, that as we understand these rhythms better, not just on a daily, but on a monthly and possibly an annual basis. And I've seen a little bit of research suggesting there's a hormonal cycle associated with solar activity and all this stuff. So that, the more we understand these sort of shells of chronological influence on us, that there's actually a selling point there to the industrial system, right. That, we can make the case that, hey, sleep is good, but I think you made this point in your Atlantic article. It's been a couple weeks since I read it, but not all sleep is created equal. And that you're going to get better sleep at certain times. And it's actually more useful to sleep in alignment with certain cycles. And I don't know. Thoughts?
Correct. I think it's not hard to sell, really. It's sort of in line with, well, I know, because Adidas looks to me for advice on how to market stuff. Like it's sort of, the people who approach you tell you really who's going to be interested in this stuff. And there is a lot of interest in sort of enhancing performance and optimizing this and that. And that's really what the application tends to be. Now, what you choose to enhance is the other question, which science cannot tell you. But it's not bad news really for anyone. It's just things that you can do. You sort of like information you can use. So I hate to be sort of, everyone wants very prescriptive kind of stuff, and I'm interested in understanding, but I really can't tell people how to sleep. But they want me to. Well,
that's very in keeping with the whole publication that you had. It's like science is the first word on everything and the last word on nothing, right? Yes. It's like I'm going to raise a bunch of interesting questions. I'm not going to give you any easy answers necessarily. But I think that's very balanced as far as archetypal solar lunar is concerned. So, I mean, is this work still occupying you predominantly? I mean, this inquiries into the biology of time, or what's taking up your attention right now?
I mean, so I'm a journalist, a freelance journalist, and so I get sent on all kinds of missions everywhere. I'm sort of in this stage of my career where I've hardly ever pitched stuff. So what comes to me is whatever a magazine is looking for, which is kind of interesting, but stuff that I would never think of. But yeah, I sort of feel like I want to follow up the book that I wrote really in 2011 is when it came out. So it's a long time ago now, with a little bit, if I can look at the bookends of Sapiens versus Homo Deus that Yuval Harari did. Yeah. It's like on a totally different scale of competence and understanding my work. I could look into the future of sleep and perhaps the end of sleep, look into possibilities that we could actually get to a place where we are doing sort of aerial refueling in terms of getting what we need while we're awake. So not having to sleep and so on.
Have you looked at all into the effects of meditation on this? Because I know, just, anecdotally, I know from a number of people, long-term experienced meditators, their sleep cycles have changed profoundly over the course of their practice, and you get to a point where you have cultivated maybe 30 years into your practice, you're not even dreaming anymore. And you don't really, phenomenologically, they report that they're not even really ever truly sleeping, that the body goes to sleep, but the awareness, that part of the brain that is aware, remains online and watches the body go to sleep and watches the body wake up. Like Ken Wilber, for example, talks about this in a lot of his books, and he says when he was in peak performance as a meditator, that he would be sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night, but that the rest that he was getting was vastly better than the rest that he was getting when he was sleeping 8 hours a night as an untrained meditator.
So there's a guy at Oxford called Vlad Vyazovsky, and he has looked, for example, at running activity. So if you are running for a long space of time, you would think that would be tiring, but people report feeling sort of refreshed after it. So what's going on? And lo and behold, you don't actually have to sleep as much if you've done this sort of like monotonous sort of meditative activity for a long stretch of time. And that kind of speaks to the fact that sleep is actually kind of a localized thing in the brain. And if you learn some new thing with your left arm one day, some skill, then that part of the brain that controls that left arm will sleep more. It will sort of see a lot more slow wave activity.
Shit.
Yeah. So it's sort of like, and even if you really tire it out, it'll do that while you're awake. You'll have, and it's not even a micro sleep, like your eyes are open and whatever, but that part of the brain will just go to sleep for little brief snippets because that's what it needs to do to renormalize the strength of its connections. So I have no doubt that something like meditation could actually get that job done during the waking hours a little bit, or make it more efficient, or change it in some way.
That kind of reminds me of the thing with aquatic mammals and having that hemispheric sleep where half the brain's asleep at a time.
Yeah.
Well, what do you know about that?
So I don't know too much about that. I think the deal there is that you have a lot more duplication among the hemispheres, so that you essentially sort of have two kind of breathing centers and two of all the essential things. But I think that's getting slightly outside of where I'm comfortable commenting on, because I would just be making it up.
So that's more of the dolphin is more of like a three-legged potato sack race of a kind of a. All right. Yeah. So if it were up to you, it sounds like you're pretty much on the line with let's get rid of sleep. Is that accurate?
I would like to give future generations that option. And I'm in favor of personal choice. But I think if sleep could be an activity that you could choose to do or not, or you could keep on doing this, groundbreaking seminal masterpiece of work that you really, it's not even sleep, it's fatigue that I'm annoyed with. I don't want to be just sort of not on my game in the evening and just slowly lose competence. It's very irritating to me. I want to get rid of it again.
What about dreaming though? I mean, it seems, I remember David Eagleman gave his seminar at Long Now Foundation in the Bay, Sausalito, California. And he discussed some of the research into the issue of dreaming and whether it actually serves a unique function or whether it's sort of a byproduct of the sleeping brain, that it has more to do with this cascade of neural firing that occurs in the brain when it's been detached from external inputs. But at the same time, you don't see dreaming or something, you don't see what looks like the neural correlates of dreaming showing up before mammals, right? I mean, I believe that you don't see dreaming in basal reptiles, for example. So that would suggest that there's something else going on there.
So there are several different sort of REM sleep explanations that have been posited, and there's not really more evidence for one than for another. But the one that I like has been explained to be thus. As you're going through the process of sleep, and you start off with a whole bunch of slow wave sleep, which is the regenerative kind of restful kind of sleep, and then increasingly toward the morning, you have longer and longer episodes of REM sleep. And it may be that it is simulating wakefulness in order to test whether you're done sleeping or not. See if you're ready to wake up.
Interesting. I had a dream last night that ended where I was nearly crushed by a crashing plane, which I took as the alarm clock. It was very clear. It was that's the end of, because it came around once and almost crashed. And it was no, I want to stay in this and see what happens. And then it came around again. I was okay, time to get up. So that would seem to confirm or not confirm, but lend credence to that particular notion. Are we ready to wake up?
That sounds horrifying. I hope it doesn't happen to you again.
It's actually not the worst dream ever. Well, oh gosh, this has been fascinating. I tend to end the episodes with a little bit of long-term, totally armchair, off-the-chain speculation. So I guess my invitation to you at this point would be, I like framing this podcast in terms of, one, it being a time capsule for the conveyance of cultural information to the distant future, that people are going to want to know in another 100 years what it was like to be alive at this time, before we were recording everything, back when we were still sleeping. But then the other part is to encourage asking the questions about or from the future. So, I mean, you can kind of take this whichever way you want. It's kind of a two-part thing. One would be like, what questions would you have for these people in whatever kind of distant or near future frame of reference that you would pick? And then what message would you hope to leave for them from Wednesday, May 10th, 2017 at 3 p.m. Central Time?
Well, I mean, that's a tough one. So exactly. I think that what we, the time capsule is being recorded at a time in which we haven't really figured out what we're doing as a species, but we know that we sort of don't like things that hurt and we do like things that feel good. And we're sort of driven by this kind of general framework. But what we have trouble with is things that we don't consciously experience at all, such as sleep, and whether that could be detracting from our overall experience. Our overall sort of the opportunity cost of that might be quite high. And so what I would sort of encourage people to do, if zooming out on the problem or question of sleep, is to think about quality of life, what makes life great, and maybe take a page from the sort of actuarial tables which adjust for things like disability, years spent with crippling diseases, and so on. And surely being unconscious has to be the most debilitating of all states. And if we're spending, as humanity, a third of our lives in this state, could this be different? And would some people maybe want it to be different? And should we put some effort into looking into this? And my answer would be yes.
Well, then I guess here's to whether it is awake or asleep, a more lucid dream of our human potential. Yeah.
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that. Jessa Gamble, thank you so much for being on Future Fossils.
Thank you. Let's do this again.
Yeah, I'm up for it. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Be sure to subscribe to Future Fossils and leave us a review. It really helps us get these conversations into the ears of other people who will benefit from them. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that at patreon.com/Michael Garfield. Be good to yourselves and have a beautiful century.
Not done here, and we may not ever figure it out. We probably won't figure it out.